Hey there, fans of A History of God by Karen Armstrong, a different atheist read series. It is Kristi, and we've done it. We have made it through the last chapter at the end of this video. And I just want to say, for all of you who've actually made it all the way to the end, congratulations, first of all, for sticking through an insane number of episodes. Second, thank you for sticking with us. I know that the schedule kind of fell apart and it's been a little bit ad hoc near the end, but we've done it, we've finished it, you stuck it out, and now we can actually draw a line under Karen, and when I have more time, I can think about the next book. So coming to the last chapter of Karen's book, A History of God. All right, I'm just going to say it. It's a shit chapter, and it's not a shit chapter, again, because Karen can't write. She writes beautifully. It's a shit chapter because it doesn't do what the conclusion of a book should do. Now, for those of you who have been with me all the way, you might remember all the way back when I made a video about the 4 important questions that a piece of writing needs to be able to address. What is my question? You need to be able to state that ideally in 1 sentence, not more than 2, in order to summarize what it is that your book is about. What are the ideas that fundamentally you want to get across to your reader and to have an answer to by the time you reach the end? 2, what is my answer? That obviously is tied to what is my question? And it should, again, be a succinct thing. You want to be able to summarize the core idea of what your piece of writing is trying to communicate, and then you can elaborate after that, right? But if you don't have a clear question and you don't have a clear answer, then you end up getting lost as you make your way through the book, because you don't have a clear sense of whether or not what you are talking about actually relates to answering the question that your book is setting out to address. The other bit is, why should you believe me? Why should the audience believe me? That has to do with the data and the methodology and the conclusions and all of those kinds of things. Karen, of course, doesn't really have that. She is very ad hoc in terms of how she picks up the authors that she does and the writers that she does and the themes that she addresses. So that part of the book has never really been a strong part. Why I should believe her has always been one of the biggest problems I've had with this book. And the 4th question is, why should I care? When she wrote in her introduction that she wanted to tie the questions of daily life and God back to what people did in the ancient world and thought about God, she gave some reason as to why that was supposed to be relevant. That it would help us to know why people thought, why and what people thought about God back in ancient times and how that's changed over time. So as an academic, when you go to the last chapter of a book, it's usually a conclusion chapter. It's a chapter that wraps up everything that's gone before. It shouldn't be 1, just another chapter, or 2, restating everything that's gone before. You have to bring all those things together in a conclusion chapter, and then you need to take it forward. You need to explain what's next. How does this, what we've just completed, ask more questions, inspire new ways of thinking, or what could we do in the future with this information now that you've spent all this time reading this book? And Karen doesn't do this in her book. She doesn't have a good conclusion chapter. And for me, at least, for those of you who are really hardcore fans and sub my channel, you know that I'm reading my doctoral thesis. And when I wrote my thesis anyway, you're always rewriting it as you go along, because you start out with a question and you go and do some background research and you collect that together. And then, for instance, in political science, I did my literature for the political science studies in terms of sex and gender and different theories of how people have tried to account for variations and similarities. Then I went outside of my discipline into sociology and into psychology, and I found parallel theoretical concepts that were missing in the political science literature, but might bring a new perspective. So then it's my job as the author to present the sociological and psychological concepts, mapping them back onto the theories and then go back and rewrite the theory chapter for the political science part in order to set up the sociological and psychological components I'll be dealing with later. So if you go back and listen to chapter 1, I mention agency sometimes. I talk about communion. I start to plant seeds in the very first chapter in order to start to frame the political science literature within a wider frame of agency and communion that I see everything in my thesis hanging from. And then go into the third chapter where I actually operationalize the measures and put them into a study and connect them back to, you know, what's been said about things in psychology and sociology in the previous chapter. And so it's a constant back and forth of reconnecting people, taking them back and going, oh, remember this was important. Well, this is how it applies here. And now that we have this new data, we take these two pieces of information, we can go over here. And the conclusion chapter, which you haven't heard yet because I haven't read it out, but the conclusion chapter goes all the way back and sort of does a mini journey through what the thesis has accomplished. And then it starts to unpack the implications of the research findings. It starts to ask questions about the ways that we use language and the normative implications of how we've been framing these things, and are there better, more accurate ways to do it that are less open to miscommunication? Are there other ways that we can analyze this data or replicate it to get better questions, or get better data, get better answers, change the context maybe in a different country? So that is what I was expecting from a conclusion, which is to wrap it up. But of course, Karen doesn't do that because she hasn't really had a conceptual framework. I tried to create one for her by looking at the various elements of God, but very quickly that fell apart because the book isn't about God. The book is about what people thought about their idea of God. And that's not the same thing as saying a history of God. A history of what people over time have thought about their notion of God is not the same as a history of God. A history of God should be about a kind of character that has, some way to specify and quantify and categorize the ways in which God has been understood throughout history. But that's not what she ends up doing in the book. So the final chapter is Scheisse because it just doesn't do what a book like this should do. It doesn't help the reader make connections that Karen should have. Karen should see as the expert in this field, as the authority, which she's not, because I looked it up and all I could find was that she had a literature degree from Oxford, which is kind of explains why it reads like a really well-written undergraduate essay. I know her book was a while ago, and maybe she's gotten to be a much better writer. But honestly, the fact that this was on the New York Times bestseller is shocking to me because it's so inadequate as a piece of writing that is meant to convey factual, historical information in the form of a narrative to sort of tell a story, a journey sort of through time. So for all these reasons, I'm going to have to give the final chapter a thumbs down, and the book overall, thumbs down. But now that I've basically poisoned the well by explaining how inadequate the chapter is, let's go through and actually look at how inadequate the chapter is. All right, I'm going to do my screen share thingy here, and we'll go over to the slides. So she starts the chapter off with a very British form of syntax. Has God a future? Not does God have a future, which makes it sound slightly more posh, but it doesn't add to the content. And I'll just read a little bit of kind of give you a sense of where she's going in the last chapter here. Like the crowd of amused people surrounding Nietzsche's madman, many are unmoved by the prospect of life without God. Others find his absence a positive relief. Those of us who have had a difficult time with religion in the past find it liberating to be rid of the God who terrorized our childhood. It is wonderful not to have to cower before a vengeful deity who threatens us with eternal damnation if we do not abide by his rules. We have a new intellectual freedom and can boldly follow up on our own ideas without pussyfooting gingerly around difficult articles of faith, feeling all the while a sinking loss of integrity. We imagine that the hideous deity we have experienced is the authentic God of the Jews, Christians, and Muslims, and do not always realize that it is an unfortunate aberration. So what Karen does in her last chapter is basically really start to push her narrative about the mystic version of God that she herself prefers, and she sees as a way to basically keep outside of intellectually rigorous questions by grounding it in a subjective perception of an ultimate reality that she cannot demonstrate either component as having a valid existence outside of her imagination. And that's generally been what Karen's take on this whole book has been. I'm just going to run through the structure of the chapter because there's not a whole lot of point, to be honest, because she doesn't have a point, really, I don't think, in this chapter. So she has a paragraph on Sartre. She has 2 paragraphs on the logical positivists. For those of you who don't know who that is, I would recommend going on Google and Google or YouTube and putting in Vienna Circle or logical positivists, and you'll learn some things. She reviews the views, she summarizes the views of a few radical theologians whose names are on the screen, and then she discusses some other theologians and their opinions, all men, of course. Then she discusses some liberal theologians, then she discusses Heidegger, then Bloch, then Horkheimer, right? And these are just, again, a series of men's opinions about things. That's it. But as we get nearer the end of the book, the sales pitch really gets turned on. Yet, as we saw in the last chapter, she writes, this type of religiosity is actually a retreat from God. To make such human historical phenomena as Christian family values, Islam, or the Holy Land the focus of religious devotion is a new form of idolatry. This type of belligerent righteousness has been a constant temptation to monotheists throughout the long history of God. It must be rejected as inauthentic. Right, so again, judgmental when it comes to other people's stuff, but then criticizes people for being judgmental. And she misrepresents atheism. Again, she writes, those atheists who preached emancipation from a God who demands such servile obedience were protesting against an inadequate but unfortunately familiar image of God. Again, this was based on a conception of the divine that was too personalistic. It interpreted the scriptural image of God's judgment too literally and assumed that God was a sort of big brother in the sky. This image of the divine tyrant imposing an alien law on his unwilling human servants has to go. This really reveals the extent to which Karen is not being an historian. She's not looking at the history of God. She is, I don't really understand why the book's title is A History of God. The book's title should be Karen Armstrong's opinion on what kind of God you should worship and what kind of God you shouldn't worship. And clearly she has a normative goal here. She's got an aim in this, which is to promote her mystical view of religious practice and to get people to change their minds and reject and adopt her opinion. Basically, it's an opinion piece, not an historical piece. She goes on to write, yet if feelings are not to degenerate into indulgent, aggressive, or unhealthy emotionalism, they need to be informed by the critical intelligence. The experience of God must be kept abreast of other current enthusiasms, including those of the mind. What does that mean in real language? Seriously, those are just a bunch of very pretty words that kind of point at something that you couldn't distinguish from your imagination, which is, again, most of Karen's book. Going on, and I'm just going to read these bits of the crap. I hope you guys enjoy the sound of my reading. Otherwise, I suppose you wouldn't be doing this series. But I pulled out the stuff that pissed me off, basically, when I was doing this at the end. Because she has all of this blah, blah, blah. This so-and-so thought that, and so-and-so thought that. And then she gets into her just giving her opinion. And I wanted to expose this opinion because it's evidence to me of what was driving and framing all of her writing throughout the book. So she writes on page 465, the God of the mystics might seem to present a possible alternative. Here's the sales pitch. That's not on the passage, obviously. So getting back to it, quote, the mystics have long insisted that God is not an other being. They have claimed that he does not really exist, and that it is better to call him nothing. This God is in tune with the atheistic mood of our secular society, with its distrust of inadequate images of the absolute. Instead of seeing God as an objective fact, which can be demonstrated by means of scientific proof, mystics have claimed that he is a subjective experience, mysteriously experienced in the ground of being. This God is to be approached through the imagination and can be seen as a kind of art form, akin to the other great artistic symbols that have expressed the ineffable mystery, beauty, and value of life. Mystics have used music, dancing, poetry, fiction, stories, painting, sculpture, and architecture to express this reality that goes beyond concepts. Utter bullshit. I'm sorry. Art is not the same thing as reality. It's, people can do things that express their subjective states. That's entirely valid. Music is valid. Art is valid. Dancing, poetry, fiction, painting, sculpture, architecture, as a way to express a subjective experience or thought or aspiration. Of course, those are real things in terms of they are real expressions of real people's feelings, or their creation of their expression of their feelings. But to say that, what was it here again? Where did it go from the ground of being? I don't even know where it is in this long chapter, but it's basically, she's saying, make it up. Just make it up. Mystics have claimed that he is a subjective experience, right? That means it's not objectively constructed. It is internally constructed, part one, mysteriously experienced in the ground of being, which is, the ground of being is it's nothing. It's just her way of saying God. So what she's saying is that mystics have claimed that he is a subjective experience, mysteriously experienced in what I think the experience of God is. That's it. So, all right, I'm not going to keep ranting on at her. It's really hard not to, but I'm not going to keep ranting on. Like all art, however, mysticism requires intelligence, discipline, and self-criticism as a safeguard against indulgent emotionalism and projection. Ooh, wow. Well, since she's a mystic, I guess she's an expert in intelligence, discipline, and self-criticism, right? Because she engaged in a lot of self-criticism in the quality of her book and her research and her sources, and when she made empirical claims about what people believed in ancient Hebrew society, she was very self-critical in looking up and having evidence for that. Oh, wait, no, she wasn't. She didn't do any of that. She just made up what people think based on what a few literate, elite, religious men thought, and generalized it to an entire population, or just engaged in wild speculation. So this idea that somehow as a mystic, she is more open to self-criticism and safeguards against emotionalism and projection, bullshit. And of course here, because in the last line too, the God of the mystics could even satisfy the feminists, since both Sufis and Kabbalists have long tried to introduce a female element into the divine. Yeah, just forget the entire 6 centuries or 5 centuries of religious oppression of women and just make your own little God, and that'll fix everything. Here you go, ladies. It's a pathetic attempt to throw a bone to women readers when she's actually done no work to justify these ideas from a feminist critical theory perspective. Lazy, lazy, lazy. It is possible to acquire some of the mystical attitudes, even if we are incapable of the higher states of consciousness achieved by a mystic. Ooh, elitism. Sorry, getting back to the text. Quote, we can learn that God does not exist in any simplistic sense. All right, for example, or that the very word God is only a symbol of a reality that ineffably transcends it. The mystical agnosticism could help us to acquire a restraint that stops us rushing into these complex matters with dogmatic assurance. But if these notions are not felt upon the pulse and personally appropriated, they are likely to seem meaningless abstractions. How about being a skeptic and our skepticism helping us to acquire a restraint that stops us from rushing in by evaluating empirical evidence and whether or not there's an appropriate methodology that has been applied to that evidence in terms of its analysis to know that it could be other people could come to the same conclusion, that other reasonable people would come to the same conclusion because it's talking about something that exists outside of our imaginations. Maybe try that. Maybe just give up this whole Byzantine structure that you've had to create to justify something that doesn't exist. This is all a massive fortress protecting a word called God that is emotional baggage for her based on what she's saying here, and defending something that is ultimately not a source of knowledge. It's a source of self-gratification, which is fine, but it's not a basis of reality. It's basically your subjective experience that you're labeling God, but it has nothing to do with reality. That's the problem here, because of her rejection of atheists as always rejecting a certain kind of God, she hasn't taken on the fundamental questions, because she's got a position that there is a reality out there that is ineffable and exists, but you can't demonstrate it. And in order to stop critique, as I said in the first video, she puts it in a box that says, oh, we can't evaluate it with the scientific method, with any kind of critical, logical reasoning or evidence, because that is, you know, that's not how God works. But she can't explain how God does work. So I can't believe I actually liked this book at one point, although I didn't get this far. I think I only made it to like chapter 4 the first time I read it, and then I don't have a distinct memory of it beyond that. But anyway, let's get done with this. She writes, human beings cannot endure emptiness and desolation. They will fill the vacuum by creating a new focus of meaning. The idols of fundamentalism are not good substitutes for God. If we are to create a vibrant new faith for the 21st century, we should perhaps ponder the history of God for some lessons and warnings. Is that the end? Yeah, that's how she ends the book. That is how she ends the book. She doesn't bring it back to the introduction. She doesn't talk about the questions that she set out to answer in the start of it. She doesn't look back on any of the chapters and try to synthesize a larger narrative. She just keeps talking. This is why it reads like an undergraduate essay and not like something from a professional, because there's no sense of closure. There's no sense that she's actually understood the scope of her work in its totality, as opposed to a bunch of individual chapters that are telling a story. And this is why, at the end of the day, it's a shit book and a shit chapter. Even if it's beautifully written, it's still scheisse, because this just fluff and assertion, and there's no citations. She's just making things up. There's no, it's like, everything I want to, like get rid of in terms of people talking crap is, there's a lot of just Karen talking crap in this book. And I guess the thing that, now that we are in the 21st century, because she wrote this book in, what was the 90s, it does make me very happy to see secularism on the rise, and to see that in the Democratic Party, I saw a piece recently that the not religiously affiliated are the largest faith group in the Democratic Party. So in terms of moving toward a secularism, human beings, yeah, maybe they can't endure emptiness and desolation, but let's fill it up let's fill up that vacuum with facts and moral agency and moral accountability and humanism. Why wouldn't we? Why would a God of your imagination be better than that? Why would a God that is a subjective interpretation of the ground of being that you attain by entering a mystical state, how is that superior than thinking deeply about a question and researching it and looking at evidence and trying to come to a decision that you think would be in the best interest of advancing the common good, or an individual's utility, or eudaimonia, or any other kind of like aspiration to improve human life? Why is that not good enough for Karen? It reminds me of that Tim Minchin song, Storm, I think it is, when he asks, isn't this enough? Just this life? Just this planet? Isn't this enough? Do you have to have magic? And I'm not quoting this, I'm paraphrasing, but do you have to have magic and sky fairies and somebody, an ultimate arbiter of justice looking out over your shoulder every single day for you to find meaning? Can't you just look around you and be amazed? Can't you look around you and be inspired by what we've done as a species and what we could still do and what we could improve and how much we could actually accomplish? And that's what does frustrate me also about theism, is that it does tend to take the eyes off of human good and put it on human subservience and human obedience, and in many sort of classed and gendered ways. So wrapping up This book is not really a history of God, of the God of the monotheists. It kind of starts out that way, but basically Karen loses the plot once we get past Islam because she stops telling historical stories and just starts to find people to talk about to get her word count up. She has no criteria as to who is an authority to speak about God. She quotes prophets, religious leaders, princes, poets, and scientists with no justification. She has no explicit criteria to evaluate God claims, although her mystical bias comes through again and again. So what have I learned from reading A History of God? Well, I have learned not to trust Karen Armstrong as an historical source, and to be more skeptical of authors who do not have advanced degrees in a relevant field. And as I said, when I looked this up to see exactly how far she had made it, she graduated from Oxford with a degree in literature. And she's since then only received honorary degrees. That's not enough. I mean, an honorary degree is nice, but an honorary degree is not a degree that you've earned and had to, do the work to defend. And quite frankly, if I wouldn't give her a degree, an honorary degree based on this. And maybe people do it because they want people to come to the graduation ceremony and speak for free or speak for a discount, so they lure them in with an honorary degree. I don't know how that system works. So, but yeah, not impressed. Not impressed at all. So, we're done. We're really done. Yay! And this means that we're now free to start another book, but it probably won't be until the autumn. I've got the election that's taking up a lot of my time, and I want to try to get back to my regular schedule, but it was Super Tuesday yesterday, and so I wanted to do a video on the election, but I thought I should do this one first and give some of the data time to come out. And yeah, so my content schedule is pretty crazy these days. And as a consequence, I really won't have time to do a book review, I think, for a little while. But again, if you guys made it this far, high five, come on, punch it in. Nice one. All right, I'm going to wrap this up now, but you guys can go bye-bye because I want to try out playing a video inside a video. And rather than set up a whole other hangout, I'm just going to do it at the end of this one. So this video is done. Stop. And the rest of it's just going to be me mucking about, trying to see if I can get a video to play inside a hangout. And that's it. All right, guys. Thanks for watching to the end. I've been Kristi, and you've been awesome. Bye. Right.
La 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 la. Here we go. Let's the bottle we rolling, tragic explosion. Like Jesus and Moses, but it's you going Jake. The Bible is shaded, it most of the take. So get educated, bring it on Jake. I'm doing stuff, what you doing? It's not a real other time. I'm the owner that made it, the biggest one. I'm talking to take it, but it's you going Jake. So I'm with the shoulder, it's not getting golden, it's about reloaded. Bring it on Jake with
All right, either that worked or it didn't. I'll find out. Bye, guys.